All right, well, while we're beginning, I want to offer an introduction as the tech work happens beside me. Well, tonight it's my pleasure to introduce a special guest from the Northwest and a good friend of the Westmont and San Francisco Urban Program, or San Francisco Westmont in San Francisco. That's our old name. Excuse me for sometimes using our former name. Ken Wystma is a leader, innovator, and social entrepreneur. His work has taken him around the world as a frequent international speaker on justice, theology, and leadership. Ken is known for his depth of insight and ability to inspire others to think deeply about faith, life, and leadership. Ken is the lead pastor of Village Church in Beaverton, Oregon, a multicultural community in Christ. He is also the founder of the International Justice Conference, which has reached over 30,000 people across 7 countries with a message of theology on justice and God's call to give our lives away. And the founder of Kilns College, where he teaches courses in philosophy and justice. Ken is the author of Pursuing Justice, The Grand Paradox, Create and Copy, and The Myth of Equality, which was recently named as one of the top 5 religion books of 2017 by Publishers Weekly, and one that we have just incorporated into our core readings at Westmont in San Francisco. He has written widely, with articles appearing in Relevant Magazine, Huffington Post, Church Leaders, Outreach, Worship Magazine, and more. Ken lives in Bend, Oregon, with his wife, Tamara, and their 4 daughters. It's a pleasure for me to welcome back to Westmont campus, Ken Wystma. Thank you.
Thank you. My apologies. I went back to get the adapter that isn't going to help us. Otherwise, I would have been here a few minutes early. I've got 2 colleagues with me from the church that I'm at in Beaverton, Oregon. My wife and I live now in Portland, Oregon with our 4 daughters. And so Insol's with me, and Dago is trying to help me out. So we just arrived today, so it's fun to be here. Brad's also been a longtime friend. We go back 5-6 years now, and met through Westmont alumni. On the board of an organization called the Freedom Story that used to be the Sold Project. It was started by Rachel Goebel, who is an alumni here, and her father is on the board of trustees. Is that what we call it here? Is it the Global Leadership? That's the same last name, in case you're wondering. But it's been fun to be a friend of Westmont and to be able to come and to interact. To try and sometimes bring interns up for the summer because the caliber of student here is incredibly high. So I've got my second daughter out of the 4 who keeps saying Westmont every time the word college comes up, and I keep saying back to her the word scholarship. And we'll see how that goes. I've got a lot of pictures to show you when we get a chance to make it work. And I chose all the high-res versions so that it wouldn't look pixelated, but that's actually what's now causing us problems with the file size. But what I wanted to talk about tonight, just coming out of something I've been thinking about now for several years. I wrote a book on race and privilege from the perspective of someone who loves theology and history, but is not coming at it from having experienced racism or bias or prejudice, but having grown up in a church culture where that narrative and that story is always at work, and trying to bring some light to some different facets of that conversation. And that brings up a lot of opportunity for disagreement and conflict. I had someone at my church that took a 5-page review that was a 1-star review on the book, and then highlight all her areas of agreement with the review and take it to leadership, even though she'd never read the book. So it's been a... say it again?
Just download it to her computer. To your Dropbox?
Yeah. It's not this one. Let's go. So I've got Dropbox. Is that? So it'd be files, I guess, or export.
Maybe save it as just select right
So
one.
Dropbox. So there's a shared folders. And Dropbox. Folder. Save. And then you share that.
Share that
folder.
with her, yeah.
Sweet. Thank you. And so, coming off that book that I worked on all the way up through 2017, was really wanting to come to a subject around words, because I think as Christians, more than most people, we live with this idea that words have power, that the world was created as God spoke it into existence, that the story of Scripture is forever talking about how we use our words appropriately, the wisdom of using our words, or how our words can show up and be folly in our life, all the way into the New Testament, where Jesus comes as the words, the beginning of the Gospel of John, the Logos. There's a lot we could go into there, but this idea of being the people of the book, of the words that God has given us, that those words are living and active. So more than most people, I think we should be starting with this idea that words have power. But when there's a proliferation of words in society, and we're all talking so fast, we really see the death of conversation. I think the loss of any kind of a traditional or historic understanding of the virtue of words. So if we were going to talk about virtue-based ethics. And then I think at a deeper self-help level, or even if you're an entrepreneur or if you're a leader, the idea that what we're trying to do in this world or create in this world is really something that's going to be birthed through the power of our words. In addition to whatever else we might be doing, it's going to come through a certain kind of speech. Does that make sense? So I wanted to talk about this idea of we become the stories we tell. It's we become the stories we tell ourselves is a quote that's been used 1,000 different places by a number of different people, but just shortening that, that we become the stories we tell, the power of words and the shaping of culture. And Michael Novak gives us a quote that I think gets us started here, and he says, "Civilization is constituted by reasoned conversation. Civilized humans converse with one another. We argue with one another. We offer evidence to one another. Barbarians club each other." And I think the ironies is hopefully not missed, that as rational creatures, as thinking creatures made in the image of God, with this beautiful power of speech, that we really should be having a kind of conversation that's generative, that's leading to a just or right world. But oftentimes we're just clubbing one another. In fact, the problem with social media is that an argument, you give your premises, and then you, if anyone, do you guys have, I've asked this, you do have philosophy at Westmont? Okay. You state your premises, and then you draw your conclusion. Therefore, here's my conclusion, based on these premises. And so most reasoned conversation, we talk about why we believe something, and then we state what that belief is. And so people can see what we're thinking, where we're getting that, and then they can assess whether the conclusion, if you will, follows logically from the premises. That's how we give an argument and how we begin to interact around. I differ with premise 2. I don't think that that's a given, or I don't think your conclusion really follows that tightly from what you've stated. The problem with the kinds of conversations we're having now online or with social media is that what we're doing is just trading opinions, which means we're grabbing conclusions without any of the argumentation and zinging them around as fast as we can. And so they hit with the force of an argument, but they don't have any of the substance that you can see or certainly interact with. Does that make sense? So ironically, there's one group of person in Scripture that's allowed to state very strongly the conclusion up front without having to argue to it, and that's the prophet. The prophet, or the prophetic voice, if you will, just gives you truth and doesn't prep you for it. It just hits you But there's such truth to it, and most people recognize that that person has lived a certain kind of life, earned a certain kind of reputation to be able to do that, to say those things that way. So ironically, what is happening in society today is that everyone is speaking in a prophetic tone, but not all of us are called to be prophets. And it's pretty hard to discern the prophetic voice when everyone's speaking in a prophetic tone. So it's like being in Los Angeles and trying to see the stars. I remember working at a youth camp, and there was someone from the inner city that had come up and had never seen the stars because he had never gotten outside of where all of the light was in downtown LA. And so we're really needing to capture this idea of conversation and right speech. So what I wanted to do was just talk about the shaping of culture and show a little bit of the powerful forces at work that way, and then talk about some examples of that, one primarily with regard to World War I, and then the other one with regard to what's called the Southern Strategy, which became a Republican strategy during the 70s following the Civil Rights Movement. To do this, I'm going to need pictures, and so I don't know what the stalwarts are here, other than I might just have to pop my laptop and point it outwards. Did you get it?
I think so.
Just right. I mean, the timing even. It's just.
Good job. Thank you.
What, do you get paid here?
I do.
You do. Do they have comment cards at Westmont? Because I don't know about you, Brad, but she definitely deserves a raise. So.
Talk to the provost.
All right. So it looks like we're working when the projector comes back up. And by the way, I love questions. That's my ideal scenario is that you can stop me in the middle or save it till the end, but any kind of interaction that allows us to take the conversation where it's at in your mind. One of the beauties of Jesus is that Jesus took all the questions. One of the downfalls of the church today is that we start with one person who's speaking at, and we never actually round that out. So please do feel the freedom to stop me or ask questions. So moving...
Sorry.
The build-up to this has been the greatest build-up of a lecture I've done in a long time. These are going to be... It looks like it's doing it. Here we go.
Yay.
All right.
Thank you.
Anyone know where this is? This building? It's a famous building. Know what city it's in? This building is in Rome, just down from the Via Sacra. It's a famous building in terms of its architecture. Both Bernini and Borromini, the two opposing architects of the 1600s in Rome, have work on this building. And what this was a college, if you will, or a part of the Vatican complex or the Catholic Church that was begun in 1622. So this is now the age of exploration, the beginning of what will become full-blown colonialism. And the idea is to create a department or an office of missionary work. So an office that's focused on the propagation of the faith. It's called the Sacra Segregatio. Do you guys teach Latin here? So the Congregation for the Evangelization of Peoples in Rome is the congregation of the Roman Curia responsible for missionary work and related activities. Is perhaps better known by its former title, the Sacred Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith, or simply the Propaganda Fide. So look at the crest there, the word propaganda showing up. If we go back to here, you see it on the sign. The first time I saw this was I grew up from age 3 to 6.5 in Europe and got to Italy as a little kid. Chased pigeons in Florence and in Venice and in the cities of Europe. But it was the second time I was leading a learning trip back through Italy and Rome that this just caught my eye. what caught my eye was the word propaganda. I didn't expect to see the word propaganda on a Catholic building. Why is that, do you think? What is our modern notion of propaganda?
Politics.
Politics, trustworthy or not? Not. Who in our minds created propaganda? Think Germany. Think. We kind of think that that this is Goebbels and Hitler in World War II, the minister of propaganda. I grew up thinking, I'm a lover of World War II. My dad was born in Holland during World War II with his father in hiding. I wouldn't exist if it wasn't for World War II, so I love studying that. But we think in America that Hitler and Goebbels invented this thing called propaganda where they brainwashed people. The word propaganda shows up a lot earlier than that, and it actually was a missionary thing about us taking faith to people and helping people find belief. So what's really going on here? Actually, propaganda in the modern sense wasn't invented by Hitler in World War II. Hitler was copying the effectiveness of the Allied propaganda machinery that began in World War I. So this famous poster was created during World War I. That's actually a self-portrait of the artist that created this. And it gave us the image of Uncle Sam. But this was not an original. He was basically just copying the work that had started a couple years earlier in England that had led to such a high recruitment of soldiers. And so there you see the counterpart. There's many different versions of the British counterpart. But this is Lord Kitchener, who was head of all the troops for England, and they needed to get people enlisted so that they could go fight. And he appealed to their sense of nationality or their sense of loyalty to country. And we simply copied it much later when we entered World War I towards the end of the war. Fascinating stuff. Tim Wu says, and he's got the definitive book on the history of advertising. He says it was not until 1915 that governments first systematically deployed the entire range of modern media to rouse their population to fanatical assent. The entry of the state into the game with its vast resources and monopoly on force would be spectacularly consequential. So the great irony is we were a part of creating what we now understand as propaganda, and we did it right after Woodrow Wilson, who ran on a campaign of neutrality, keeping us out of the war, wins the election right before we go into the war, and he takes the guy that was the head of marketing for his campaign, basically the Karl Rove. Anyone know that name? It was a big name like 10 years ago when some of you were 10. Karl Rove was the strategist for George W. Bush, and he was the brains of the operation. He had all of the brains, and George W. had none of the brains. But so this guy, there was a guy by the last name of Creel who did this for Woodrow Wilson, and as soon as Woodrow Wilson gets elected, he creates a committee for public information, the CPI, that none of us know about, and basically put this guy, his campaign manager, in charge of it to drum up support for what was going to then be the war. So let me just read you a couple stats that I've got in the book here. The CPI would come to comprise 20 domestic subdivisions with a staff of 150,000 dedicated employees, all aimed at shaping public opinion and garnering support for the war effort. Massive. They printed 75 million pamphlets and books and reached a very precisely estimated 134,454,514 men and women with short pro-war messages delivered by volunteers and celebrities before they would do the little black and white newsreel things. They'd have someone get up and read a memorized or written out real quick little blurb that was very pro-war. These are staggering numbers, and this propaganda profoundly shaped how Americans thought about national pride, democracy, and our duty to promote democracy in the world. Woodrow Wilson, his declaration of war speech, which contains one of the most influential sentences of the 20th century, said, "The world must be made safe for democracy." My whole lifetime, I've been living with the U.S. involved all the way around the world because we live with this idea that we have this responsibility to make the world safe for freedom, to make the world safe for democracy. Even George W. Bush, when he went into Iraq, was making it safe for democracy there. It comes out of this era and the words that Creel created with this propaganda. Propaganda changed the American cultural landscape not only by creating fervor for war in what had previously been an ambivalent and neutral country. We were a nation that had a lot of immigrants from a lot of different countries. We were a rural nation of farming and the like, and nobody wanted to go get involved in Europe's war. Most of the people that had immigrated from Europe. They didn't want to get pulled into that. There was a lot of debate about whether we should join on the German side or the British side. The last time we did anything with a war with England was when we fought against them. I think for us, it's easy to think we're natural allies with Britain or with England. But for most of our history, those were the people that we had fought and won our independence from. Germany, Christian nation, Protestant nation, a lot of German immigrants, the Lutheran Church, etc., was a part of this. We should be with Germany in this war. In fact, shortly after World War I is when Prohibition is put in. Prohibition, who knows what Prohibition was? I saw that hand. You were just, do you know what Prohibition was?
Yes, that's when they outlawed liquor.
They outlawed alcohol for 10 years, it lasted. Who was making the beer? Anheuser-Busch, Schlitz, what are some of the other? Almost all the big beer manufacturers were of German descent. In fact, Anheuser-Busch took out a full-page ad of the New York Times during the Great Depression arguing for why economically we needed to repeal Prohibition. Before Prohibition, we didn't have an income tax, so we only taxed the sale of goods. So by eliminating all alcohol, which was something like 20 to 30% of what was taxed, it severely affected the economy. So Anheuser-Busch is arguing for this. So some of the anti-German sentiment after World War I is part of how we ended up with Prohibition. I'm getting sidetracked. But what I want to say is this idea of anti-German comes up to such a high degree that German had been the most sought-after second language in America. Would you think of that today? It's kind of hard for us to even wrap our minds around. In fact, we used to call it German music. What do we call it now? Classical music. Beethoven, Bach, Mozart. It was German music. There was even towns where they organized the killing of German breeds of dogs. So an ambivalent country that wanted nothing to do with war went into such an overdrive with so many dedicated resources that we took everyone to a pro-war, anti-German place with a deep nationalism that actually plays itself forward into the flag debates of today and even how we marshal our armed forces around the world in terms of making the world safe for democracy. The power of what happened in World War I is incredible. Studies of propaganda are, in the most general sense, studies of language and its use in the public domain. We're shaping things. Language, whether in the form of messaging, mythology, poetry, metaphor, or even imagery, conforms to culture. This is a student that I had at Killens College that did his dissertation on propaganda. But what I would want to say is that words shape culture and words emerge from culture. And so we shape the culture that we live in through our words, but then we inherit the fruit of our words from granddaddy to daddy to us, how we think about the world, how our mind sees things, words that we react to and words we don't react to. I've had the hardest time for the last decade trying to talk about social justice in the church because for a lot of Christians, it smacks of another phrase called social gospel. And social gospel is out of bounds. Ask somebody that feels that way, though, or says that, why it's out of bounds. And they can't tell you a single thing. They can't even tell you when the social gospel was. They can't give you a name of somebody that was a part of the social gospel. And by the way, half of the social gospel was bad. I think it was bad theology. It was watered down Christianity. Half of it was incredibly good, and most of us would resonate with it in terms of social action and justice for the poor, the vulnerable, the oppressed. But those words that get passed down, that this is heresy, that this phrase is somehow a bad phrase, you grow up this way. I remember being taught by a church when I was 8 years old that women were bad because they were proponents of this ERA. It was called the Equal Rights Amendment under Jimmy Carter. Welcome back, Carter. Jimmy Carter in the late 70s. And there was a big bill in front of Congress about basically a lot of equality things for women. And our church was against it. Most churches were, because they saw it as an attack on the traditional family. And that was being communicated to me in such a way that as an 8-year-old, I was feeling that women somehow were bad because of what they were trying to do. Those kinds of things stick, and then you have to deal with them. But words shape culture, then they emerge from that culture, and then in turn deepen the culture in which we live. It just digs and kind of etches a groove. Does that make sense? So if we continue forward, I just want to give one more example, and I'm going to do it very cursory, but it's to do with our idea of race. This is the 1964 election results for president. Red is Republican. It's one of the biggest landslides ever, by the way, for Johnson. Kennedy was shot. Johnson became president. Johnson ran against Goldwater. Johnson beat him by a landslide. Goldwater was from Arizona. That's this one. So he won his home state, and then he won 5 other states. What's interesting about that? What year was the civil rights movement? The civil rights legislation. The civil rights movement from the 50s all the way into the 60s. But the big civil rights legislation that gets passed is passed in what year? It's a rhetorical question for a reason. Yeah, that's what I mean by rhetorical. 1964. You guys, that's my form of call and response. Obvious questions. So, 1964, the legislation goes in ending segregation, and this is seen as an infringement on states' rights by the South. The South, up until 1964, almost to a state in every presidential election, with 1 or 2 minor examples when there was a candidate emerging from that state. But basically, all of the states in the South, from the time of the Civil War till this year, voted what? Democrat. What was the party of Lincoln? Republican. The South was Democrat, and it was white Democrat, and it was the power block. All of a sudden, after 100 years, the Civil War ended in what year? 1865. I think April 1865. After 100 years, all of a sudden these 5 states pop up red. What's the primary motivation here? Again, maybe race. Race is the primary motivation here. What are all these states now in elections? Red. Now, a lot has changed, and certainly it's evolved and gotten nuanced, but here's Nixon's campaign strategist, Kevin Phillips. We talked about Creel with Woodrow Wilson, Karl Rove with George W. Bush. This was Richard Nixon's campaign strategist, and in a New York Times interview, he said this back in 1970. From now on, the Republicans are never going to get more than 10 to 20% of the Negro vote. And they don't need any more than that. But Republicans would be short-sighted if they weakened enforcement of the Voting Rights Act. The more Negroes who register as Democrats in the South, the sooner the racist or negrophobe whites will quit the Democrats and become Republicans. That's where the votes are. Without that prodding from the blacks, the whites will backslide into their old comfortable arrangement with the local Democrats. So what he's saying is push hard for blacks getting the vote and to be able to vote as much as they want and to have it be as easy, because that's going to trigger the racism of the South against that, which means that these people now are going to leave the Democratic Party and come to the Republican Party. So the strategy of the Republican Party here, called the Southern Strategy, was to actually play off of the racial tensions in the South to grab what was the power or the wealth of the South, which was the white voter. So when we get to things like Willie Horton, so Willie Horton, does anyone know the name Willie Horton? It's probably one of the most famous, along with the Daisy commercial. So look that up later when you get home. But the Daisy commercial was actually pulled from the air, but it was Goldwater Johnson and a little girl counting down from 10 to 1 and picking the petals of a daisy. And then all of a sudden it counts 1 to 10 in a man's voice and a nuclear bomb goes off. I mean, it's just fear-mongering, right? This is what's called race baiting. So think of a fishing line and you put bait on it. You're trying to catch something when you're race baiting, meaning you're playing off people's fears to distract them and then to be able to manipulate them with your message, with your argument, or your propaganda. Another way of talking about this kind of political ad is called dog whistle politics. Anyone ever heard that phrase? Dog whistle, you train your dog to do a behavior when you blow the whistle. Okay? So when you do something that's like blowing a whistle so that you get a pre-programmed response by a group you're trying to reach in terms of a commercial or an advertisement, it's dog whistle politics. You're just playing off of their prejudices. So Willie Horton had been given a pass by Dukakis, Michael Dukakis. I remember this race when I was a kid growing up. He'd been given a weekend pass to get out of prison, to go visit family, etc. While he was out, he went and raped and I think killed a woman. Now, you'd have to go back to segregation to really understand how rape and the fear of white society and using that kind of gendered violence as a form of propaganda to justify lynching and to justify all sorts of violence, even if it wasn't the person that did something or made an overture. It doesn't matter. It's going to serve to keep that population in check. I mean, just horrendous things are tied to this idea of gendered violence, this idea of black men in the South, this idea that comes all the way forward. So here you get an attack against Michael Dukakis because while he was governor, he let a man out and that man went and committed a crime. That's one of the reasons why it's so hard to get justice for people once they're incarcerated. For a president to let people out, to change drug laws and go, we now have legal marijuana. What's up with all these people in prison because of marijuana violations back when they were sentenced? It's so hard to get those people released. Why? Because if they get out and do something bad, it somehow then attaches to you in terms of responsibility, right? But this is dog whistle politics, again, playing off of the ideas and the prejudices. And this comes from political strategy and manipulating groups of people. Instead of trying to argue for the better nature within them, we're taking the more base things and posturing that voting block. So words shape culture. Words emerge from culture, and then those same words again shape culture. So our fears and what that does to a society that can then be played on with words to manipulate people into voting, which then means we have to, every 4 years, work those people up again by telling them those stories again to try and get the same kind of pre-programmed result. This happens in culture. Words shape culture way more than we realize. This is an example of propaganda. I would like to say that words shaping culture and words emerging from culture and then back around is another way of saying we become the stories we tell. And the stories we tell drive who we become, which then means we're going to tell those stories. And so I could put up pictures from segregation in the South. I could put up pictures from the Civil Rights Movement, pictures from elections and the Voting Rights Act, and then I could put up a picture of Willie Horton and basically draw that all the way to Charlottesville and boys on a college campus marching with torches and show how this whole cycle keeps going round and round as we tell stories in a way without understanding their full power. I want to talk about cultural forms real quickly because once we understand culture, then we're going to bring words back into it and try and walk out of here with hopefully some motivation or encouragement on what we can do. But there's different ways of talking about culture. Generational culture is like the old people in my church are one culture, and I'm not that culture. I'm a different culture. But it takes like a 10 to 20 year swing, and you have shared values. We were talking about this today in the car. Does anyone know Saved by the Bell? Made a comment to one of the students in our church, and he, who's Zach Thomas? Morris. I know Zach. I don't know either. I watched it for years. If I said young grasshopper like to you, would you know what I mean by that? I'm a Karate Kid. It's like I'm an older, wiser teacher talking to you, young grasshopper who's going to learn. Another one that got missed on our youth. But when you get generational cultural differences, they're deep and they're entrenched. I was asked to write an article for, I think it was Huffington Post, on the millennial generation and that they're named the social justice generation. And is this a good thing or a bad thing? And I argued that it was a good thing. That yes, some of it might be faddish, and so somehow maybe there's a bandwagon effect, but for the millennials, seeing things from around the world because of the internet, because of media, developing the empathy for vulnerable people, for understanding how other people see the world and our place in the world as Americans, those are generational things for millennials. And when millennials are 60 years old or 70 years old, they're still going to have and carry a lot of those cultural norms, right? So I argued that it was a good thing, and that we're seeing not just a fad here, but the emergence of a generation that has some deeply held values. Pop culture is different. Pop culture is Justin Bieber. It's what was the latest boy band before the current one?
I'm too old,
I don't know. I take my daughters on their birthdays and half birthdays out to dinner, daddy-daughter date, and then we always go to Claire's. I have 4 daughters. They want to get earrings and all that. It's amazing every year how all of this stuff is replaced with whatever the new boy band is. Not One Direction. Was it One Direction?
One Direction.
Yeah. That was at least a couple years of lunch boxes and whatever. Pop culture is very faddish. It ignites, it burns very bright, you jump on, but it's not a deep generational cultural value. It's the herd running in a certain direction. Does that make sense? This is a new phrase that I've been using, but it's constantly evolving culture, CEC, if I'm writing it, in parentheses. It speaks to the fact that we don't have these set blocks anymore like we do with generational culture, that with technology and with social media, that everything is so fluid and it's moving so fast. So if words shape culture, then the proliferation of words in different pockets and among different tribes means the mass pluralization and rampant fluidity of cultural norms and values. This is what we're seeing to a large degree in a lot of places, right? That things are really moving fast, accelerating fast, as Thomas Friedman would say. Trying to catch up with the herd, overtake people in the herd, or get to the front of the herd doesn't say anything about knowing where the herd should be running. Instagram is this for me. The church that I was just at, I planted it 12 years ago, and there was a whole group of young people that lived for Instagram, and it was they always knew what they were trying to do with Instagram, but I don't know that they ever really knew what they were trying to do, or what we as Christians should be trying to do. And so this game of catch up to try and in some sense be where things are evolving or where culture is going is a little bit of a trap. If we get pulled into that riptide, we can be putting a lot of energy into this without even knowing why we're doing it. Secular culture is a big overarching thing to say that when God is not the dominant value in culture, we're getting a worldly perspective, a humanistic perspective on culture. And the key word here is colonization. I have a friend, Mark Sayers in Australia, wrote a great book called The Disappearing Church. And he argues in a very persuasive way about that when we live as Christians in a dominant society that's secular, that the society at large is at all times trying to colonize our mind so that we would forget or lose or minimize the values that inherently belong to us as being citizens of the kingdom of heaven. That at all times, I love Netflix, but there's an influence that's coming there. I love knowing what's going on in our country, but there's parts of it that can distract me from going, my citizenship is in heaven, not my citizenship is in this nation. There's at all times this idea that in secular culture, we have to be aware that we're resisting, actively trying to disrupt the ways in which our minds are being colonized that way. So a society that is deeply affected by propaganda will be one in which certain legitimate routes that an individual's life path can take will be closed off. What I want you to say right now to yourself is, I don't want that to be true of me. I want all of the avenues available to me. I want complete freedom, and I want God to influence me in the way that God would have me go. It's God that directs our steps, says the book of Proverbs, right? So to do that, in some sense, we have to know where the propaganda is coming from and how to put that aside and try and hear clearly, see clearly what it is we should be doing. So to bring it back around, I want to talk about the witness, our witness, and the church, the body of Christ, as being countercultural realities that represent the kingdom of God. So the first thing here is just that we become the stories we tell. And if that's true, and our words have power to resist colonization in some sense, or the effects of culture and how that pulls on us, the fluidity that's going on outside of us, we have to know what stories we should be telling. We have to know what is good news about the good news. We have to know how to name it. We have to know how to give thanks for it. We have to know how to be grateful for it and the kinds of words that come out of our mouth when we're telling that story. We have to know how to offer praises because we're actually praising God because of where He is in our story, in our narrative of shaping us. Why we actually have an allegiance to God. We have to actually find the words and tell those stories. We have to know who we are supposed to be. Ephesians 4:29, let no unwholesome words come from your mouth, but only that which is helpful for building up others according to their needs. We are supposed to be agents of reconciliation. God has given us the ministry of reconciliation. God is redeeming all things, right? So if we're a part of God's work of reconciliation, then our words that have power are supposed to build up and lead to love, or create the conditions for love and lead to unity. There's a wisdom and a maturity of building up rather than tearing down. Tearing down is how we create divides, put the walls up even higher. What's crazy to me about all the talk of the wall with Trump is that the metaphor of a wall is being magnified in almost every conversation from every direction, whatever political party you're coming from. So this physical wall, we're not realizing that if we're against that in terms of what it stands for, then we understand what walls do to people, or how they separate us, or how they create antagonists. You know, the word river is a Latin word that basically comes about from this competition. Whoever is on one side of the river is going to be against the person on the other side of the river, up the river from down the river. And so you get this Latin word that comes along for river that actually kind of shows us that whenever there's a boundary marker, that's when you're going to have the tension, right? Our words can build up, or they can create walls and tear down, and we have to know what's going on. Our words need to not be propaganda. They need to demonstrate truth, and that God has a plan, and that plan has power in this world. So Paul says in 1 Corinthians 2, verse 4, my message and my preaching were not with wise and persuasive words. He wasn't a minister of propaganda, but of reconciliation. He came with a demonstration of the Spirit's power. We're going to worship in spirit and in truth. There's something about being in the narrative of God that gives our words power. Being the people of God. The church, simply for me, on Sunday mornings, we speak the words of God. That's teaching. That's encouragement. We tell the stories of God. It's thanksgiving. It's praise. We pursue the will of God, which is liturgy and confession. So ultimately, church is about us being in a time and a place with other believers gathered together so that the power of words can work a redemptive effect on the body of Christ, so that we become the best version of ourselves, a light to the nations as we're called to be. So if you're a leader in this room, if God gave you influence, if you aspire to leadership, I just want to tell you that your job as a leader is to give the people that you're trying to lead the lexicon that they should be using. I think one of the greatest responsibilities and opportunities of a leader is to guard the words of the group, of the organization, of the club, of the campus, and to say, these are the words that we're going to use with each other. This is the lexicon. This is the dictionary. If you own the dictionary, you are leading. If in owning the dictionary you have good words in the dictionary, then you're leading well. If you own the dictionary, but it's nothing but put down sarcasm, tearing people down, using humor in a destructive way, then you're leading, but you're leading poorly. So I would argue this. A church's health can be measured by the kind of words that are spoken to one another. Does that seem fair? And if that's true, then I believe a church can become healthy by focusing on the kinds of words that are spoken to one another. I'm in a new church. I've been there all of 1 year. And I think for me, the greatest challenge, but also the greatest responsibility that falls on my shoulders is to change the culture around what we say and how we say it. That we're a truth-telling culture. That we say what needs to be said. We don't hide things in the shadows or whisper in the corners. When we put things in the shadows or whisper in the corners, what does it do to the people that aren't in the know or in the corner? It creates suspicion. And nothing kills unity quicker than suspicion. If we create churches where we don't radically tell the truth, be radically honest at all times, not radically critical, but just radically honest in terms of telling the truth, whether it's an affirmation or something that I just need to let you know, this is how this made me feel, or you seem to be doing this to these people and it's causing destruction. Let's talk about it. Is there pain in your life? Why are you doing this? But we have to learn to be radically honest. And when we do that, we can shape the culture. When we shape the culture then will tell a different kind of story. And as the culture tells a different kind of story, the culture will only reinforce itself and become a better version of what we've hopefully set it up to become. Does that make sense? So my big takeaway is simply that the propagation of the faith, propaganda fide, is very different than propaganda. And I think we can set those two things up and say we grew up hearing about propaganda and we see it everywhere in the world. And we can reject that and come back to maybe the more original Latin version or meaning of this as a religious concept, the propagation of the faith, where we're able to go out and with our words and in power speak a truth that this world so desperately needs to hear. So with that, I'll just leave it, but I'd love to hear what your thoughts are or questions just with regard to words and the stories that we're telling ourselves. I think we're doing how are we doing for time, Brad? How much time do we have?
About 15 minutes for questions and comments.
Yes.
Could you give an example of how you would start, like, changing the culture through words, like at your new church or even at Westmont, how that would look a bit more like tangibly?
It looks, someone has to define it. So the person God has given leadership ability to or mandate to has to go, what is the vision for this community? How can it be a better version of itself? And what would be different about how we're talking if we go towards that better vision? And then that has to be communicated, and that can be communicated a lot of different ways. It can be a subversive, kind of fun. You grab 10 people and you go, let's change Westmont, just by us covenanting together to be different. And now this is the new cool instead of that. And then, so it's a subversive way. You can get up in front of, if God's giving you the gift of speaking, you get up in front of chapel and you just go, here's an opportunity. Let me paint you a picture of what we all want. We know we all want this. And you create a campaign around that. Or you put it in writing. One of the things we did for our staff recently was to write out what we expect of staff, to have staff values, and to have a code of conduct. It's hard to say to somebody that's out of bounds if you haven't actually drawn the boundaries. Does that make sense? This is what we're aiming for, and we're going to hold each other accountable to it. And if you step outside of these lines, then it's a lot easier to say something when it's not ambiguous or abstract, right? So I think there's a lot of way, but it's leadership, it's seeing it, it's finding the words, communicating those words, and ultimately clarifying so that other people can join you. Leadership is, the easiest definition is when people are following, right? I know somebody that really wants to be a leader, but nobody follows. So if you're talking about changing something like Westmont, it's gonna have to involve leadership where people actually are gonna buy into that and come along. That's a great question. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
How has changing the stories and words that you've said and told personally affected your life?
I think we go in different seasons in our life. I could tell you where I'm at with the church and reshaping and trying to reshape that culture. I just did a big move, left a safe environment, left what was a picture of my life where I traveled 25% of the time, and now I'm primarily focused on one community. I remember when we started our church, and it was easy for me to say, all of you have been abused by churches and spiritual abuse, and that's awful. Come to this church because we're not going to be like that. And then I remember at the 10-year anniversary, I confessed to my church how painful it was at 10 years to realize there were people out there, some people out there that would probably say this was the place or I was the person that made faith hard for them. So I think one of the things I'm relearning is a narrative of shame, and how shame is a way of putting all of the worst things about yourself in front of yourself and then hitting repeat on whatever that song is. Brene Brown, I haven't gotten into all of her work, but I know she's probably the best at this. But shame is so attached to telling the wrong story of ourselves, right? I think when we can move from shame to maybe a healthy kind of guilt or humility that says I've learned a lesson, then we can look to our future and go, I'm now telling a story to myself about who I'm becoming, or all that I've learned. So I've made mistakes, but I do believe I make less now than I used to, and that the consequences hopefully aren't as bad as they used to be. So I do think there's something that we have to get at here about our disappointments, our pain, our shame, that's maybe different than the kind of corporate leadership that we were talking about. But it's powerful. By the way, when you have two people that are at odds, they are both telling stories to themselves over and over about why the other person is so awful. And both of their stories are the bits of data that they're picking that reinforce the conclusion that the other person is completely at fault. One of the greatest things you can do on a college campus or in a dorm, or if you're an RA, is to disrupt that kind of storytelling and force somebody to have to add different data to what they're trying to tell themselves, so that they realize, maybe I actually contributed something to this too. Maybe this person did these things, but their motive isn't what I'm making it out to be. I should probably go talk to them and work past this. But peacemaking is not a passive thing. It's a very active thing where you're disrupting the stories that are being told. By the way, this is a big thing where I'm at with leadership. We have a lot of older people that have been at this church for a very long time, and just a lot of people that maybe don't like change. But strategic change is nothing more than the intentional disruption of systems and structures, or the status quo. Strategic change is nothing more than the intentional disruption of the status quo. So I have to look at the status quo and say, if this is not the picture of perfection of God's kingdom, then it has to be disrupted for us to pursue something that's a better picture of God's picture of the kingdom. So when someone comes and feels upset that I'm doing something wrong, or I'm a bad leader, or I'm heretical, why? Because I'm upsetting or disrupting the status quo, I have to train my leaders to go, no, that's actually his job. And if you don't understand the reasons why he's disrupting that particular thing and changing it, then you need to go ask so that you can see the why behind it, right? But just so-and-so doesn't like Ken doesn't work. People have to be able to use their words. It's like when your kids fight and you're like, use your words. Why are you upset? Name your emotion so that you can work your way past it. Okay. One or two last quick things. Yeah.
First of all, thank you for coming out here and speaking tonight.
Thank you.
You talked a lot about words and the weight that they hold and how we use those in communication. But the other half of communication is listening.
Yeah.
And so my question is, how do you view that relationship between speaking and listening, and suggestions on how to be an active participant through listening?
Yeah, I'm not allowed to give advice on listening because I'm horrible at it. So I try not to be at least knowingly a hypocrite. I do have a lot of thoughts on solitude, and have a lot of deep practices at various points of my life where that has been where everything has come from for me. And even now, the last couple of years, I loved international flights because 15 hours meant that I could have a conversation with God that I could strongly believe I'd be able to get to the end of. Actually, no, if God really wants to talk to me and I'm on a 15-hour flight international, like, he can probably get his point across, right? Like, so we talked, my co-author, a friend of mine, AJ Swoboda, I wrote a chapter in here where we talked about Henri Nouwen and Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And both of them kind of the same idea, but I'll take Bonhoeffer's version of it. But Bonhoeffer said that if you don't ground your insecurities in solitude with God, if you don't find your identity there, then you go to community just looking to assuage your insecurities, right? And we all know this, right? We come home and lay down in bed and we're like, that didn't go the way I would have envisioned. I saw myself being so much more of a loving person and making other people happy, but somehow I did this, and I can almost see it, right? But if we ground ourselves in solitude with God, then we can actually come to community with something to give. And so I do think there's this rhythm to silence and to words. I think when God meets Elijah's fought the prophets, and he's really worked up, and he's really scared, and he's really frantic. And God's like, we're not starting the conversation where you're at. You're going to change and start the conversation where I'm at, and I'm not frantic. So he makes him rest, sleep, wakes up again, sleep, wake up. And then God eventually comes in the still small voice, or the little wind. And I think there's something about God always starts the conversation where he's at emotionally. Not necessarily. He grounds it in where he's at emotionally, despite our emotions. And I think that's partly what we find in solitude. When we're running too fast, we try and bend God over into the freneticness or the tone or the anxiety of where we're at, our insecurities. I just want to go to one last question, and then we'll call it good. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for telling us about the power of words. I think, like you say, words are pretty powerful, like they can be breeders or breakers. And I think I've experienced that in my life. But also there's this saying that says actions speak louder than words. Mm-hmm. And so my question is, how can we as a people know and live being aware of the power of words, but also without being stuck at just words, like just moving on from that? What do you suggest?
Embodied speech is the highest form of communication. So the word taking on flesh, the incarnation is this picture of the power of words really dwelling amongst us in an example that's true and resonates, right? So actions do speak louder than words. It's still communication. It's just not audible. It's visual, right? So we talk about that, different forms of communication in the book, but I do think you're hitting on a very key point that at the end of the day, it's communication that we're talking about, and the words carry communication, and communication is really about relationship, and relationship is really about trust. So words speak louder than words means I trust you when I can see that you're not a hypocrite, that you actually are one with your words, right? So it's really relationship communication that's going on here with regard to communication and words. The other thing I just want to say is we have this phrase, sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never hurt me. That was told to a child by a very creative parent somewhere along the way because words were hurting them. Right? The whole thing gets its force because we have to try and brainwash ourselves because we're feeling the pain of somebody's words hurting us, right? So the very fact that exists proves that it's actually untrue, right? And so I do believe in the power of words and speech, but I do think when we're getting to the spiritual side of this, it's much deeper, granular, and it's really about how we live our life and what that witness looks like. That's St. Francis, right? Preach the gospel at all times, but only when necessary use words. So that's a great point. Thank you for that. I'll call it there. I didn't bring any copies of this book. Someone can have this one for free because it's marked up and whatever. But I've got some of my other books here, and because you guys are Westmont, I'll give them to you at my price, which is half off. So if anyone wants a book cheaper than you'll find it anywhere, I'm happy to get you some of those over here on the way out. So thank you.
Thank you. Won't you join me in thanking Randy for his talk?